The lie of a wedding dress was its weight. Ella had always imagined something ethereal, a whisper of silk and lace that would float as she walked. The reality was a cage of bone and brocade, a gilded sarcophagus that promised not a new life, but a beautifully decorated end to one. Each pearl sewn into the bodice was a stone, each yard of velvet a shroud. It was this weight, this suffocating finality, that gave her feet the strength to run. She fled not from a man, but from a sentence. Lord Valerius, with his wet mouth and his hands that were always too close, was merely the executioner. The true prison was the life he offered, a long, slow drawing and quartering of the soul. So she ran. She ran from the torchlight of the keep, from the laughter of guests who saw a political merger and not the sale of a girl. She tore the veil from her hair, letting it snag on a rosebush in the garden, a ghostly flag of surrender she refused to wave. Her satin slippers, meant for polished floors, were shredded by the gravel of the courtyard, and then lost entirely to the greedy mud of the outer fields. The cold earth shocked her bare feet, a brutal baptism into a world without comfort. The forest was a black maw ahead, the place of childhood nightmares and cautionary tales. The Blackwood, a place where things with too many teeth and not enough soul were said to hunt in the perpetual twilight beneath the ancient canopy. Her father had warned her of it. Her septa had crossed herself at its mention. It was a place of certain death, and it was the only place she had left to go. The first branches felt like skeletal hands grabbing at the heavy silk of her gown, tearing at the life she was trying to shed. She ripped the fabric away, heedless of the sound, of the value. She knew she was leaving a trail, but in the dark, in the chaos of her flight, she gambled that pursuit would wait for dawn, and by then, rain or dew would obscure the path. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of slick roots and unseen hollows. A sharp pain lanced through her ankle as it twisted, a sickening pop that echoed in the profound silence. She cried out, a thin, sharp sound that the vast woods swallowed without effort. She stumbled on, dragging the injured leg, the pain a hot, insistent drumbeat against her panic. Every shadow was a beast. Every rustle of leaves was the pursuit she dreaded. Her breath came in ragged, burning sobs. It was not the rumored vampires she feared, not yet. The monster in her mind had a human face, a signet ring that bruised, a laugh that curdled the blood. The thought of Valerius's men finding her, of being dragged back to that keep, to the knowing sneers and the stifling room that awaited her, that was a terror far more immediate than any creature of the night. She would rather be devoured by a nameless thing in the dark than consumed slowly by a man in the light. The moon, when it appeared through the dense lacework of branches, was a sliver of bone, offering no comfort, only illuminating the gnarled, watching faces in the bark of ancient trees. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, a funereal perfume. How long had she been running? An hour? A lifetime? Time had dissolved into a simple, brutal rhythm. Pain, breath, fear. Pain, breath, fear. Her lungs were on fire. The wound on her ankle throbbed with a life of its own. She could feel the warmth of blood now, sticky against her skin. She fell, her hands sinking into the cold, wet leaves, the impact jarring through her exhausted body. She tried to push herself up, but her limbs refused. The world tilted, the trees spinning into a dark vortex. Her last coherent thought was not of defeat, but of a strange, quiet defiance. She had chosen this. The thorns, the cold, the coming darkness, they were hers. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows around a colossal oak. It moved with a silence that was not natural, a gliding grace that didn't disturb a single fallen leaf. It was tall, impossibly so, a figure cloaked in the night itself. As it drew closer, the faint moonlight caught the sharp planes of a face that was neither old nor young, a sculpture of pale marble and stark angles. The eyes that looked down at her were dark, ancient, and held not malice, but a profound and weary stillness. He saw the ruined dress, the bare, bloodied feet, the defiant terror in her wide eyes before they fluttered closed. He knelt, his movement a fluid, unbroken line. His fingers, cool as river stones, brushed a stray strand of muddy hair from her cheek. He felt the frantic, fading pulse in her throat, a tiny, frightened bird beating its wings against the bars of a failing cage. The scent of her blood was a sharp, sweet song in the air, a call to the hunger that was his oldest companion. But beneath it, quieter and far more compelling, was the scent of her fear, her pain, and the unyielding iron of her will. It was a fragrance he had not encountered in a very long time. He gathered the broken girl into his arms. She weighed almost nothing at all. Ella woke to the gentle crackle of a fire. The sensation was so alien, so deeply at odds with the cold dread she had fallen asleep with, that for a moment she believed she was dead. Perhaps this was the afterlife, a warm room, the scent of burning cedar, and the soft weight of a wool blanket over her. She lay still, listening. There was no sound of guards, no distant echo of feasting, no suffocating presence of Lord Valerius. There was only the fire and the quiet hum of a silence that felt protective, not menacing. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was made of dark, heavy beams, smoke-stained from years of use. The walls were stone, smooth and cool. She was in a bed, a real bed, with clean linens and a thick fur throw. Her wedding dress was gone. In its place, she wore a simple chemise of soft, worn linen. It was blessedly light. She pushed herself up, a sharp pain in her ankle making her gasp. She looked down. Her foot was propped on a pillow. The ankle was tightly and expertly wrapped in clean bandages. Someone had cleaned the mud and blood from her skin, tended to her wounds with a care she hadn't known since her mother died. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced the warm fog. This was a trap. A different kind of trap. Kindness from a stranger was more dangerous than cruelty from a known enemy. Cruelty had clear rules. Kindness had hidden costs. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her good foot touching a smooth, polished stone floor. The room was large and sparsely furnished, dominated by a massive, unlit hearth opposite the bed and shelves upon shelves of books that lined the walls, their leather spines gleaming like sleeping jewels in the firelight. A single, high-arched window showed only an impenetrable, starless dark. I would not advise walking on that. The voice came from the shadows near the hearth. It was a low, calm baritone, a voice that seemed to absorb sound rather than project it. Ella's head snapped toward the source. The man from the forest unfolded himself from a tall-backed chair that had been lost in the gloom. He moved into the firelight, and she saw him clearly for the first time. He was dressed in dark, simple clothes of a fine cut that bore no sigil or house colors. His hair was black as a raven's wing, falling straight to his shoulders, framing a face of arresting, ascetic beauty. It was a face built for stillness, for watching centuries turn to dust. His eyes, dark and unreadable, held hers. He made no move toward her, simply stood by the fire, his presence filling the room more completely than any armed soldier could. "Who are you?" Her voice was a dry rasp. "Where am I?" "My name is William," he said, his voice even and deliberate. "And you are in my home. You are safe." The word safe struck her as a profound absurdity. She was in an unknown fortress, deep in the heart of the Blackwood, with a man who moved like smoke and looked at her with the unnerving calm of a predator. "Safe?" she repeated, the word brittle with disbelief. "The tales." She trailed off, not daring to give voice to the superstition. A faint, sad smile touched his lips, a fleeting expression that did not reach his eyes. "The tales are for children, to keep them from wandering too far." They are stories woven from fear and ignorance. Like most stories, they contain a kernel of truth, but it is buried deep. He took a step closer, and she flinched back, pressing herself against the bedpost. He stopped immediately, a gesture of deference that was more disarming than any threat. You were injured, exhausted. You would not have survived the night. You should have left me, she said, the words sharp with a defiance she didn't feel. It would have been a kinder fate than what you have planned. She knew how this worked. Rescue was a transaction. She had nothing to offer but herself, and she would rather have died in the woods than trade Valerius's cage for another. He regarded her for a long moment, his gaze so intense it felt as though he were reading the hidden text of her soul. I have nothing planned, he said, and the simple sincerity in his tone was a crack in her armor of suspicion. I am offering you sanctuary. Stay in my domain. You will be safe from those who hunt you. When you are healed, if you wish to leave, I will not stop you. That is all. Ella stared at him, searching for the lie, the subtle twist of language that concealed the hook. There was none. His expression was open, his posture relaxed. He was not demanding, not commanding. He was offering. It was a concept her world had no place for. Sanctuary, not servitude, not a bargain, a gift. Why? She asked, the question a raw whisper. Why would you do this? Because I know what it is to be hunted, he said softly, and because I have not seen a will to live as fierce as yours in 500 years. It would have been a shame to let it be extinguished by the cold. The number hung in the air between them, fantastical and terrifying. 500 years. The kernel of truth. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate bird. She was in the lair of the monster from the stories, and he was offering her tea and bandages. The sheer, dizzying incongruity of it all made her head swim. She looked at his calm, patient face, then at her own bandaged ankle. She thought of Valerius's men, surely scouring the forest edge by now. She thought of the cold and the pain and the certainty of her fate if she were caught. She had run to the forest seeking a quick death over a slow one, and instead she had found this. An impossible choice. But it was a choice. I accept, she said, her voice barely audible. She did not know if she was signing her own death warrant or stepping into the first safe place she had ever known. As he gave a slow, solemn nod of acknowledgement, she suspected, with a chilling certainty, that it might somehow be both. The next morning, William led her from the castle. The word felt too grand for the structure, which was less a fortress and more a spire of dark stone that seemed to have grown from the earth itself, weathered and ancient, covered in ivy that was black in the perpetual shade of the forest. They walked a short distance along a winding path of smooth gray stones to a cottage nestled in a small, secluded clearing. It was built of the same dark stone and heavy timber as the main keep, with a thatched roof thick with moss and a small, sturdy-looking door. Smoke curled from its chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the dense canopy of leaves. This will be yours, he said, his voice a low murmur beside her. He had offered her his arm for support, and after a moment of rigid hesitation, she had taken it. His touch was cool through the fabric of her sleeve, his presence a steady, solid thing to lean against. The simple act of courtesy was so jarring, so contrary to her expectations, that it kept her perpetually off balance. He opened the door and gestured for her to enter. The inside was small, just one main room with a sleeping loft above, but it was clean and warm. A fire was already laid in the hearth, casting a cheerful glow over the simple wooden furniture. A sturdy table and 2 chairs, a small pantry stocked with dried herbs, sacks of flour and oats, and a cask of what smelled like cider. A loaf of fresh bread sat cooling on a rack, its scent filling the small space with a promise of simple, honest sustenance. In the sleeping loft, she could see a bed made up, with clean linens and a thick quilt. There were no bars on the single window, which looked out into the silent, silver-barked trees. There was no lock on the inside of the door. You will have privacy here, William explained, remaining on the threshold, as if not wanting to intrude on the space he was giving her. Food will be brought to the larder each morning before sunrise. There is a well behind the cottage for water. You are free to go anywhere within the bounds of this valley. The river to the east marks the border. Do not cross it. My protection does not extend beyond. He paused, his expression darkening slightly. That is not to say the boundary is a wall that cannot be breached. It is my reputation that keeps intruders at bay, their fear. But fear is not absolute. Desperate men, sufficiently motivated or sufficiently armed, may convince themselves to cross. It has happened before, though rarely. Ella stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking it all in. It was a cage. It had to be. A prettier, more comfortable cage than Valerius's keep, but a cage nonetheless. The invisible walls of the valley, the unseen border of the river, they were still walls. She looked at him, her eyes narrowed with the suspicion that had been her shield for so long. And what do you ask in return? He met her gaze, his own dark eyes unblinking. Nothing. The word was a stone dropped into a still pool. She waited for the ripples, for the hidden conditions to surface. They did not. Nothing? She echoed, her voice sharp with disbelief. No one gives anything for nothing. What service do you require? Am I to be your servant? Your companion? The last word came out laced with a venomous memory of Valerius's insinuations. For the first time, a flicker of something other than calm patience crossed his face. It was a deep, ancient sorrow, a shadow of pain that made him look infinitely older than his ageless features suggested. I require no service, he said, his voice lower now and softer. I am offering you a place to heal, a place to be. The only thing I ask is that you do not try to harm yourself or my home. That is the entirety of the bargain. He placed a small iron key on the table. This is for the door. It locks from the inside. And with that, he turned and walked away, his dark form disappearing into the gloaming of the forest, leaving her alone in the sudden, overwhelming silence of the cottage. She didn't touch the key for a long time. She limped around the small space, running her hands over the rough-hewn wood of the table, the cool stone of the hearth. She checked the pantry again, finding cheese, dried fruit, a small wheel of honey. It was all real. She climbed the ladder to the loft, her injured ankle protesting with every step. The bed was soft, the quilt heavy and warm. It was more comfort than she had ever been afforded in her father's house, where she was merely a commodity to be polished and maintained until sale. The first few days were a torment of waiting. She existed in a state of hypervigilance, every creak of the cottage, every rustle of leaves outside her window, sending a jolt of adrenaline through her. She ate the food, but each bite felt like a trick, a poison that would indebt her further to her mysterious keeper. She slept in short, fitful bursts, the key to the door clutched in her hand, a useless talisman against a creature who surely had no need of doors. She expected him to appear at any moment, to reveal the true nature of their arrangement, to demand the payment she was certain he would eventually exact. He never came. True to his word, food appeared in the larder while she slept. A pail of fresh goat's milk one morning, a basket of dark, wild mushrooms the next, a small pot of honey. Always simple, always enough. She never saw who brought it. After a week, her ankle had healed enough for her to walk without much pain. Timidly at first, then with growing confidence, she began to explore. She walked to the edge of the clearing, then into the woods themselves. The forest was different in the daylight, or what passed for daylight in this valley of eternal twilight. The sun was a diffuse, silver glow high above the canopy, filtering down in shifting patterns. The air was cool and clean. The oppressive menace of the night she had fled through was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding quiet. She found the river, a ribbon of black water rushing over smooth stones. It was just as he had said. This was the border. She stood on the bank, looking across to the woods on the other side. They looked no different from the woods she was in, but she felt the invisible line he had drawn. She could cross it. Nothing was physically stopping her. She could run again, take her chances in the world beyond. But the thought of it brought not a surge of hope, but a cold wave of exhaustion. Out there were Valerius's men. Out there was a world that had tried to crush her. Here there was a strange, unnerving peace. Here, there was bread on the table and a key for a door she was beginning to realize she didn't need to lock. For the first time in her life, no one was demanding anything of her. The absence of expectation was a freedom more profound than any open road. She turned her back on the river and walked back to the cottage that was, impossibly, becoming her own. 3 weeks bled into 4. The rhythm of Ella's days settled into a quiet pattern, dictated by the soft, perpetual twilight of the valley and the slow mending of her own spirit. The constant, thrumming anxiety that had been her companion for years began to recede, leaving behind a stillness she hadn't realized was possible. She learned the sounds of the forest, the hoot of a gray owl at dusk, the chatter of a squirrel in the high branches, the whisper of wind through the pine needles. These sounds were honest. They held no hidden meanings, no veiled threats. She discovered a small, untended garden plot behind the cottage, choked with weeds, but with the faint, stubborn outlines of old planting rows. On an impulse born of a desperate need to do something, to create rather than merely exist, she began to clear it. Her hands, soft and pale from a lifetime of useless needlepoint, were clumsy at first. She broke her nails in the dark, rich soil. She pulled nettles that stung her fingers. But the work was grounding. It was real. With each weed she pulled, it felt as though she were clearing away a piece of her own past, making space for something new to grow. She found a rusty trowel and a small hand fork in a dilapidated shed nearby, and to her surprise, a sealed tin box containing seed packets, carefully preserved and dated in William's precise hand from only a few years prior. The garden, though neglected, had not been entirely forgotten. The work became her ritual. William watched her. She would feel his presence before she saw him, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a deepening of the shadows at the edge of the clearing. He would stand perfectly still by the tree line, a tall, dark silhouette against the silver bark of the birches, and simply observe. He never approached, never spoke. At first, his silent vigil had terrified her, a constant reminder of her captivity. But as the days passed, the nature of his observation seemed to change, or perhaps her perception of it did. It did not feel possessive or menacing. It felt curious, attentive, almost protective. One evening, as the silver light began to fade into the deeper violet of night, she was kneeling in the garden, pressing tiny seeds she'd found in the forgotten tin into the newly turned earth. She sensed him and looked up, her heart giving its customary little jump. He was there, at the edge of the trees, but this time he took a slow step forward, then another, emerging from the shadows into the clearing. He stopped a respectful distance away. "They are late-season herbs," he said. His voice, after the long silence between them, seemed startlingly loud in the quiet air. "Horehound and thyme. They will grow, even with the weak sun." Ella sat back on her heels, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek with the back of her hand. She had rehearsed 100 conversations with him in her mind, demands for her freedom, accusations, fearful pleas. But faced with this simple, peaceful opening, she found she had nothing prepared. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice a little breathless. "I planted this garden a very long time ago," he said, a hint of memory warming his tone. "For someone else who needed something to tend." He did not elaborate. The past for him was a vast, deep country whose borders he kept well guarded. She looked from his still, watchful face to the dark soil under her hands. "It helps," she admitted quietly, "to have something to do." "I know." The simplicity of his understanding was a small, unexpected gift. He did not question her. He did not offer platitudes. He simply acknowledged the truth of her feeling. They fell into a silence that was no longer tense with suspicion, but companionable, filled only with the scent of damp earth and the cooling air. "Your ankle," he said, his gaze dropping to where it was now unbandaged, a faint bruising the only remnant of the injury. "It has healed well." "Yes," she said, "thank you." The words felt inadequate for the care she had been shown, but they were all she had. He gave a slight inclination of his head. "You are a fast healer." He paused, and she felt he was choosing his next words with care. "You were wise to run to the Blackwood. Lord Valerius's men searched the borders for a week. They used dogs, but they would not enter. The stories your people tell serve their purpose." A cold dread washed over her, the memory of the hunt sharp and sudden. "You saw them?" "I saw them," he confirmed. "They have since returned to their master, empty-handed. They believe the forest took you. They will not be back." She stared at him, the implication of his words slowly dawning. He hadn't just offered her a cottage and food. He had been actively shielding her, standing as an unseen guardian between her and the world that would have dragged her back. The protection he'd offered wasn't passive. It was a deliberate, continuous act. The realization sent a tremor through her. The walls of the valley that she had seen as a prison suddenly felt like sheltering arms. You turned them away," she whispered, half a question, half a statement of awe. "I ensured my peace was not disturbed," he said, his phrasing deflecting any sense of personal debt. But she understood. He had done it for her. He had kept his promise. He had kept her safe. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, not as a monster or a captor, but as the architect of her impossible peace. She saw the profound loneliness in his stillness, the ancient weariness in his dark eyes. He was a creature of shadow and silence, yet he had given her a place of warmth and quiet growth. In that moment, kneeling in the dirt of a forgotten garden, Ella felt the first tentative roots of trust begin to push their way through the hard, barren soil of her fear. She didn't know what he was, not truly, but she was beginning to understand who he was. Their evenings fell into a new, unspoken routine. As the light in the valley softened to a dusky lavender, William would emerge from the woods and she would rise from her work in the garden. He would not come to the cottage door, but would wait for her by a small stone bench that sat beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak at the edge of the clearing. She would wash the dirt from her hands in the basin outside her door and bring a clay mug of cider or mint tea, and they would sit together as the stars began to appear, pinpricks of cold fire in the gaps between the leaves. Often, they did not speak at all. The silence between them was a language in itself. Ella had spent her life surrounded by noise, the clatter of the castle, the endless, meaningless chatter of ladies-in-waiting, the booming pronouncements of her father. Silence had always been a thing to be filled. But with William, it was a space to be shared. It was restful. In his presence, she felt no obligation to perform, to smile, to please. She could simply be. One evening, he brought her a book. He held it out to her as she approached, a slim volume bound in dark, supple leather. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His skin was cool, smooth as polished stone, and the brief contact sent a strange, not unpleasant shiver through her. She looked down at the cover. There was no title. "What is it?" she asked, tracing the unmarked spine. "Poetry," he said, "from a land that no longer exists. The language is dead, but I thought the sentiment might not be." She opened it. The script was elegant, unfamiliar, but below each verse, in a precise, meticulous hand, was a translation. She read the first few lines, a verse about a migratory bird finding an unexpected winter haven. The words were simple, beautiful, and resonated so deeply with her own situation that it felt as though he had reached into her mind and transcribed her own unspoken feelings. A flush rose in her cheeks. He saw her. He understood more than he ever let on. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. I haven't read a book in a long time. My father saw it as a waste of time for a woman." "Your father was a fool," William stated, not with anger, but with the simple finality of a man stating a fact, like the sky is dark or stone is hard. The casual dismissal of the man who had held absolute power over her was breathtakingly liberating. This small exchange opened a door. Her questions at first were tentative, confined to the world around them. She asked about the plants in the forest, the names of the constellations she could see through the canopy. He answered each question with a quiet, patient authority. He knew the history of every stone, the lineage of every tree. He spoke of the forest not as a thing to be conquered or feared, but as a living entity, a complex tapestry of which he was just one ancient thread. One night, emboldened by the growing comfort between them, she asked a more personal question. "You said you planted this garden for someone else. Who was she?" The stillness in him deepened. He looked out into the darkness, his profile a stark, beautiful carving against the night. "Her name was Iona," he said, his voice a low whisper of memory. "She was like you, fleeing a life that was not her own. She found her way here many years ago." "What happened to her?" Ella asked gently, sensing the fragility of the moment. "She stayed for a season. She healed, and then she chose to leave." He turned his head to look at her, his dark eyes holding a universe of ancient sorrows. "I offered her the same choice I offered you. Sanctuary, for as long as it was needed. She chose to return to the world. I hope she found the peace she was looking for." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. He let her go. It was another piece of the truth, another brick in the foundation of her burgeoning trust. He was not a jailer. He was a harbor master, offering safe port in a storm, knowing that ships are meant to sail. The realization that he would, without question, let her leave if she asked, paradoxically made her want to stay more than ever. She began to see the loneliness that clung to him like a shroud. He was an island in the river of time, a silent observer to the endless procession of lives that began and ended beyond his borders. She was, she realized, the first significant thing to wash up on his shores in a very long time. Her presence was a disruption to his unchanging existence, a flicker of warmth in his cold, eternal twilight. The next evening, she brought 2 mugs of tea to the bench instead of 1. She held one out to him. He looked at the steaming mug, then at her, a flicker of surprise in his ancient eyes. He did not drink, of course, but he took it, holding it in his cool hands as if to warm them on a memory. It was a small gesture, a simple act of domesticity, but it shifted the balance between them. She was no longer just the recipient of his care. She was offering a piece of it back. He had given her a home, and she, in turn, was beginning to invite him into it. In the quiet of the vampire's forest, a life was being built, not on bargains or debts, but on the shared solace of 2 lonely souls. One morning, as she returned from drawing water from the well, she found him standing outside the cottage in the soft twilight. It was unusual. He typically waited until evening to appear. "Who brings the food?" she asked, curiosity overcoming her. William's lips curved in a small smile. "I do," he said, "before sunrise, before you wake. Old habits from when I moved unseen through the world." The simple domesticity of an ancient vampire playing milkmaid brought a startled laugh from her throat. The sound seemed to please him, and a warmth flickered in his dark eyes. It was another piece of the ordinary made extraordinary, another thread binding them together. The sound came on the wind, thin and sharp, a discordant tear in the fabric of the valley's peace. Horns, and beneath their brassy call, the fainter, more frantic baying of hounds. Ella was on her knees in the garden, thinning out a row of young carrots, the sun a pale wafer in the sky. She froze, the tiny, feathery green tops crushed in her fist. Her blood ran cold. It was a sound from another life, a sound of men and horses, of pursuit and capture. A sound that did not belong here. Panic seized her, immediate and absolute. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure terror. Her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted to the trees, to the path leading to the river. Run. The instinct was primal, a scream in her bones. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling, her gaze wild. The world outside the valley, the world she had almost managed to forget, was clawing at the borders of her sanctuary. Valerius. It had to be. He hadn't given up. He was a man for whom a wife was property, and he would not suffer his property to be lost. Ella. William's voice cut through her rising panic, a calm, low anchor in the storm. He was there, standing not at the edge of the clearing, but halfway between the forest and her cottage, closer than he had ever been in the daylight. He had appeared from nowhere, as if summoned by her fear. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on her, and in their depths she saw not alarm, but a grim, resolute stillness. "They are on the ridge," he said, his voice carrying easily on the quiet air. "To the north. Still a great distance away, but the wind carries the sound." "He's found me," she whispered, her voice trembling. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile gesture against the encroaching cold of her fear. "He sent them. They'll drag me back." The image of Valerius's triumphant, cruel face filled her mind, and a wave of nausea washed over her. All this peace, this fragile, budding hope, it was all an illusion, a brief respite before the inevitable end. "They have not found you," William corrected her gently, taking a slow step closer. "They have found the edge of the Blackwood. They are hunting, but they are hunting blind. They are afraid. They will not cross the river easily." "You don't know that," she cried, her voice cracking. "He will force them. He'll offer them gold, he'll threaten their families. He will not be denied." She knew the man's obsessive nature, his bottomless pride. Being defied by a woman, his intended bride, would be an insult he could not bear. He would burn down the entire forest to reclaim what he believed was his. William was before her now, his shadow falling over her. He did not touch her, but his proximity was a physical weight, a shield. "He can threaten all he wants," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur that held the cold promise of centuries of violence. "There are older fears than that of a petty lord. This forest answers to me. Its shadows are mine to command. Its beasts heed my voice. But I will not lie to you, Ella. Desperate men with the right tools can breach any sanctuary. If they have silver or sacred symbols, they can harm even me. My power is greatest in full darkness. At twilight I am strong but not invincible." He paused, his expression softening. "But they will not find you. I will not allow it." She looked up at his face, and for the first time, she saw the monster of the tales. It was not in his features, which were as still and perfect as ever. It was in his eyes. The weary patience was gone, replaced by a chilling, absolute authority. It was the look of a king in his own domain, a predator whose territory had been challenged. And all of it, all of this ancient, terrible power, was coiled in her defense. The realization was as terrifying as it was breathtaking. He saw the fear in her face, and the hardness in his expression softened instantly, replaced by that familiar, gentle calm. "You are safe, Ella," he said, his voice once again a quiet reassurance. "I gave you my word." She stared at him, her frantic breathing slowly beginning to subside. His certainty was a balm on her terror. He was not guessing they would be safe. He was stating a fact. The horns sounded again, fainter this time, as if the hunting party were moving away along the ridge, not daring to descend into the valley of shadows. The baying of the hounds was a frustrated, receding cry. The immediate threat had passed, but the spell of her peace was broken. The outside world was real. Valerius was real. The life she had fled was not some distant memory. It was a hungry beast, pacing just beyond the borders of her sanctuary. She sank onto the stone bench, her legs suddenly unable to support her. William remained standing before her, a silent, dark guardian. He let her absorb the shock, let her process the violent intrusion. He understood that the danger was not just physical. It was the violation of her security, the reminder that her freedom was a conditional, fragile thing, dependent on his power to protect it. After a long silence, she finally spoke, her voice small. "They will be back." "Perhaps," he conceded. "Men like your Valerius are driven by pride. It is a powerful and foolish motivator." "What will we do?" The word slipped out before she could stop it. "We." Not "what will you do for me," or "what should I do," but "we." The quiet acknowledgement of a shared fate, a shared problem. William's expression did not change, but she felt a subtle shift in the air between them, a drawing closer that had nothing to do with physical proximity. "You will continue to tend your garden," he said softly. "You will continue to read your book. You will continue to live. And I will continue to keep my promise. Let the world of men rage at the borders. It cannot touch you here." She looked up at him, at this impossible creature of night and shadow who spoke of promises and safety. He had offered her sanctuary from the monsters of the world, and she had not realized that to do so, he would have to be a monster himself. But his monstrosity was aimed outward, a shield to protect the quiet, fragile life growing within his domain. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and laid it on his arm. It was the first time she had initiated contact. Through the cool, fine fabric of his sleeve, she felt the unyielding strength beneath. "Thank you," she whispered, and for the first time the words felt like enough. The intrusion of the outside world, though terrifying, had changed something fundamental between them. The polite distance they had maintained, the careful dance of protector and protected, dissolved. The shared threat had forged a new, more intimate bond. The evenings they spent on the bench were no longer just a quiet sharing of space. They became a time for stories. It began with her. One night, as the first stars pricked the violet canopy, she found herself telling him everything. Not just the abstract fear of her arranged marriage, but the small, suffocating details of her life. She spoke of Lord Valerius's clammy hands and the way his gaze lingered on her neck. She described her father's cold indifference, the way he had looked at her as nothing more than a deed to be signed, a parcel of land to be traded. She spoke of the crushing loneliness of her gilded cage, the endless days of silent embroidery, the constant pressure to be placid, decorative, and empty. She spoke for a long time, the words pouring out of her in a low, steady stream. It was a story she had never told anyone, a truth she had barely dared to admit to herself. To speak it aloud was to give it shape, to validate its weight. Throughout it all, William listened. He did not interrupt, did not offer judgment or pity. He simply sat beside her, his stillness a vessel for her pain. His silent, focused attention was a gift more profound than any words of comfort could have been. It made her feel heard, truly heard, for the first time in her life. When she finally fell silent, her throat raw with unshed tears, he did not fill the quiet with platitudes. He waited, allowing her words to settle in the cool night air. Then he said, so softly she almost didn't hear it, "No one should have to purchase their own survival with the currency of their soul." The simple, elegant truth of it broke through the last of her defenses. A single tear escaped and tracked a hot path through the cool dust on her cheek. He did not reach for her, did not offer a comforting touch she was not ready for. He respected her space even in her moment of greatest vulnerability. This quiet, profound respect was the most intimate gesture she had ever known. In the nights that followed, he began to share pieces of his own story. He did not speak of violence or of the nature of his curse. Instead, he spoke of time. He described the world as it was when the stones of his keep were new. He spoke of forests that now lay buried under cities, of rivers that had changed their course, of stars that had shifted in the sky. His memories were not grand historical accounts, but small, personal snapshots. The taste of wild honey from a forest that had vanished centuries ago. The sound of a language no one living now remembered. The face of a stonemason who had helped him build the very cottage she now lived in. A man whose entire lineage had since risen and fallen into dust. His loneliness was a tangible thing, a vast, silent ocean. He had watched generations live and die, watched civilizations crumble, watched the very geography of the world change around his unchanging home. He was a living relic, a man out of time, and the weight of his accumulated years was a burden she could only begin to imagine. "Why do you stay here?" she asked him one night, her voice full of a gentle curiosity that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. "You could go anywhere, see anything." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the endless expanse of his past. "When you have lived as long as I have," he said, his voice a low, melancholic murmur, "you learn that places do not change as much as people do. I stay because this land remembers me. The trees know my name. The stones recognize my step. Out there," he gestured vaguely toward the world beyond the valley, "I am a ghost, a story. Here, I am real." She understood then that this valley was not his prison any more than it was hers. It was his sanctuary, too. His anchor in the ceaseless, brutal current of time. They were two refugees, finding shelter in the same quiet harbor, each for their own reasons. Their conversations deepened. He asked her about her hopes, the ones she had harbored in secret before Valerius. She spoke of wanting to learn, to read books of philosophy and science, not just the approved texts of scripture and household management. The very next evening, he brought her a stack of books from his library, treatises on botany, astronomy, the works of forgotten poets. He would sit with her as she read, the two of them sharing the comfortable silence, the only sound the whisper of a turning page. She, in turn, brought more of her world into his. She began to sing softly as she worked in the garden, old folk songs her mother had taught her. She picked the wildflowers that grew in stubborn patches near the woods and placed them in a jar on her table. These small acts of life, of beauty and hope, were a stark contrast to the stagnant, unchanging twilight of his existence. He would watch her, a strange, soft expression on his face, as if he were seeing color for the first time after a lifetime of gray. The woman he had found, broken and bleeding at the foot of an oak tree, was gone. In her place was this person, strong, quiet, and possessed of a resilience that was beginning to bring life back not just to a neglected garden, but to a place and a man that had been sleeping for centuries. The shift was as subtle and inexorable as a change in season. It was in the way he no longer waited at the edge of the clearing, but would come to stand by her garden, his hands clasped behind his back as she weeded or watered. It was in the way she no longer flinched when he appeared, but would greet him with a small, genuine smile. The space between them, once a chasm of fear and suspicion, had shrunk to a comfortable arm's length, charged with a new and unfamiliar energy. The fear was gone. She realized it one afternoon with a jolt of surprise. She was walking by the river, the invisible boundary of her world, and the thought of crossing it, of fleeing, no longer held any appeal. The world beyond the river was a place of cages. This valley, this small pocket of eternal twilight, had become the only place she had ever felt truly free. Her freedom wasn't in the ability to leave, but in the choice to stay. A choice she was making, consciously, every single day. His protection, once a terrifying mystery, was now a source of deep comfort. She knew he watched over the valley, that his ancient power was a silent, sleepless sentinel. She felt it not as a threat, but as an embrace. She was safe in a way she had never been, a safety that allowed the bruised parts of her soul to finally begin to heal. Love, she discovered, was not a sudden, dramatic event like the poets he gave her to read described. It was not a lightning strike or a consuming fire. It was a quiet, patient thing, like her garden. It was the slow, steady process of turning over hard soil, of planting seeds of trust, of tending them with daily acts of kindness and understanding, and then waiting, with a fragile hope, for them to grow. One evening, a cool breeze whispered through the valley, carrying the first hint of autumn. She had built a small fire outside the cottage, and they sat near its warmth, the flames painting flickering light onto his pale, still features. He was telling her about a constellation that was only visible from this valley during this time of year. A small, faint cluster of stars the old myths called the Lost Sisters. They say they were 7 sisters who fled a cruel king, he murmured, his eyes on the darkening sky. They ran until they could run no more, and when his hunters cornered them, they prayed to the moon to save them. The moon took pity and lifted them into the sky, where they could be together forever, safe from his reach. Ella looked from the sky to his face. The story was so close to her own, she knew he had chosen it for her. "Is that what you are?" she asked softly. "My moon?" William turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers across the firelight. The air crackled with more than just burning wood. The unspoken things between them, the carefully tended emotions, rose to the surface, suddenly too powerful to be contained by silence. "I am no god, Ella," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "I cannot place you in the sky. All I can offer is the shade of these trees, the quiet of this valley." "It's enough," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she could no longer name as gratitude. It was more, deeper. "It's more than I ever had." He rose and walked around the fire until he stood before her. He looked down at her, his expression one of profound, aching tenderness. He had seen her at her most broken, her most terrified. And she had seen him in his profound loneliness, his eternal solitude. They had seen the truth of each other, stripped of titles and tales. Slowly, as if afraid she might break, he reached down and cupped her face in his hands. His touch was cool, but it burned like a brand against her skin. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, a quiet sigh of surrender escaping her lips. This was not the touch of a captor, or a master, or a monster. It was the touch of a soul who recognized its counterpart. "I find myself reluctant to imagine this valley without the sound of your singing," he confessed, his voice barely audible. "I have grown accustomed to the light you bring to this twilight land." She opened her eyes. His face was inches from hers. She could see the flecks of silver in his dark irises like distant, ancient stars. "And I," she said, her voice trembling slightly, have grown accustomed to the peace I find only in your shadow." He had given her sanctuary. He had given her safety. But what he had truly given her was a choice. And in that moment, she made it. Not the choice to stay in the valley, but the choice to step into the space he was offering her, the space beside him. She lifted a hand and laid it over his on her cheek. The ache of connection, so long feared, was now a quiet, overwhelming joy. The monster of the Blackwood and the runaway bride had found in each other not an escape, but a destination, a home. The peace was shattered by a single sharp command that echoed unnaturally through the valley. "There, by the cottage, seize her!" The voice was rough, human, and utterly alien in this quiet place. Ella and William broke apart, the intimate spell between them instantly broken. At the edge of the clearing, where the path from the river began, stood 3 men. They were clad in the muddy leathers and dented helms of Valerius's household guard. 2 held swords, their blades gleaming dully in the twilight. The third, a burly man with a captain's insignia on his pauldron, held a crossbow leveled directly at Ella's heart. Her blood turned to ice. It was impossible. They had crossed the river. They had breached the sanctuary. The world of men, with all its brutality and greed, had finally broken through. William moved, placing himself between Ella and the men with a speed that was a fluid blur. He did not draw a weapon. He simply stood there, a tall, dark shield, his stillness more intimidating than any threat. "You have come a long way to die," he said, his voice calm, yet carrying a resonance that made the very air seem to vibrate. The leaves on the trees shivered. The captain sneered, though fear flickered in his eyes. The tales of the Blackwood were one thing to mock from a tavern stool, and another to face in the flesh. "We've come for the lady, Lord Valerius's property, and we've come prepared." He pulled back his cloak to reveal a bandolier of silver daggers and a pendant with holy symbols. "The old village crones told us how to fight your kind. Silver and sanctified steel. We're not the fools who came before." Ella's mind reeled. Silver, sacred symbols. The men had done their research, armed themselves with the tools that could harm him. This wasn't a bluff. This was a calculated assault on the one person who stood between her and her old life. "She is not property," William said, his voice dropping to a deadly low pitch. "And she was not stolen. She is here by choice." "Lies of a demon," the captain spat. "Men, take her. I'll deal with the shadow." The 2 swordsmen advanced, their steps hesitant. They were afraid, but they were more afraid of Valerius. Ella backed away, her heart pounding. She looked at William. His face was a mask of cold fury, but she saw the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes tracked the silver weapons. He could destroy them. She felt the shadows gathering at his command, but not without cost. Silver could wound him. Sacred iron could burn. And if even one bolt found its mark while he was weakened, in the twilight rather than full dark, it could be devastating. William turned his head slightly, never taking his eyes off the men, but his next words were for her alone, a low, urgent murmur. "Ella, there is a path behind the keep. It leads up into the high rocks. It will take you out of the valley on the western side. They won't follow you there. Go now. I will create a diversion. I will give you time to escape." She stared at his back, at the rigid line of his shoulders. He was offering her an escape. Again. He was willing to face these men, to face their silver and sanctified weapons, to give her a chance at the freedom he had promised her from the very beginning. Even now, when it meant losing her. Even now, when it might mean his own destruction. He was honoring his promise to its most absolute, heartbreaking conclusion. The choice was laid bare before her, stark and terrible. She could run. She could take the freedom he was offering, bought with his own life, and disappear into the world, forever looking over her shoulder. or she could stay. She could stand with this ancient, lonely creature who had shown her more kindness and respect than any human man ever had. She thought of the life that awaited her if she ran, a life of fear, of hiding, of being forever the runaway bride. Then she thought of the life she had found here, the garden, the books, the quiet companionship, the feeling of being truly seen. It was a small life, a twilight life, but it was hers. And it was a life with him. The swordsmen were closer now, their blades held high. The captain was drawing back the string of his crossbow for another shot. "No," Ella said. The word was quiet, but it cut through the tension with the clarity of a bell. William's shoulders went rigid. He did not turn. "Ella, go," he commanded, his voice strained. "This is not a choice. This is survival." "No," she repeated, louder this time, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She took a step forward, and then another, until she was standing beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm. She faced the terrified, aggressive men, and she was not afraid. "My place is here." She looked up at William. In his eyes, she saw shock, disbelief, and then a dawning, overwhelming wave of emotion that was so powerful it seemed to shake him to his very core. For 500 years, he had been a sanctuary that others passed through. For the first time, someone had chosen to call the sanctuary home. The captain of the guard laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "A fool's choice, my lady. You'll die with him." "I would rather die with him," Ella said, her voice clear and steady, "than live with you." Her words were a declaration, a vow, a final, irrevocable choice. She had not run into the forest to die, she realized. She had run to find a reason to live, and she had found it, standing here in the shadows, beside a monster who was more of a man than any she had ever known. The choice, once made, settled in her soul with a profound and unshakable peace. William turned his head and looked down at her, and the ancient weariness in his face was replaced by a fierce, blazing light. He had offered her freedom, and she had used it to choose him. A slow, terrible smile touched his lips, a smile directed not at her, but at the men who had dared to threaten his world. He had something to protect now that was infinitely more precious than his own solitude. The shadows at his feet began to deepen, to writhe and coalesce like living things. The captain's bravado finally shattered. The man before him was not just some hermit skulking in the woods. The air grew impossibly cold. The fire behind them sputtered and died as if starved of air. The forest, which had been a silent witness, seemed to awaken, 1,000 unseen eyes opening in the darkness, a low growl seeming to emanate from the very earth beneath their feet. This was not just a fight against one man. It was a fight against the Blackwood itself, and he was its heart. What are you?" the captain stammered, his crossbow wavering. William's smile widened, showing a flash of white. He reached out and took Ella's hand, his cool fingers lacing through hers, a solid, grounding presence. "I am the reason your children have nightmares," he said, his voice a silken whisper that promised oblivion. "And you have trespassed in my home." He took a single step forward, and the shadows lunged with him. The two swordsmen screamed, short, sharp, cut off with terrible finality. Their weapons clattered to the ground. The captain's crossbow fell from his trembling hands. But William did not kill him. Instead, he gripped the man by the throat, lifting him effortlessly, his eyes blazing with cold fury. The shadows writhed around them both, a living darkness that seemed to drain the very warmth from the air. "You will return to your lord," William said, his voice a death knell that seemed to echo from the stones themselves. "You will tell him what you saw. You will tell him that the Blackwood keeps what it claims. And you will tell him that if he sends another soul into my domain, I will visit his keep personally, and I will show him what true darkness means. Do you understand?" The captain's face was ashen, his eyes rolling with terror. He managed a jerky nod. William released him, and the man stumbled backward, gasping. The captain didn't look at his fallen comrades. He didn't look at Ella. He simply turned and fled, crashing through the undergrowth in blind terror, his men's weapons abandoned on the ground. The sound of his panicked flight faded into the distance, swallowed by the deep silence of the forest. Ella did not know how long they stood there, her hand clutched in his. The silence that followed the brief, terrible violence was absolute. When she finally found the courage to look, the clearing was nearly empty. The two swordsmen were gone, consumed by shadow, their existence erased by the ancient power that now stood breathing softly beside her. Only their weapons remained, gleaming dully in the twilight, testament to what had been. She looked up at William. His face was pale, his expression strained. The effort of what he had just done had cost him. "You let one live," she said softly. He met her eyes, and she saw in them a weary wisdom. "Fear is a powerful weapon," he said quietly. "That man will spread the tale. Valerius will hear what happened to his men, and his pride will force him to declare you dead, a tragic victim of the forest. He cannot admit that his bride chose a monster over him. He cannot admit that his best hunters were broken by the Blackwood. The story will spread, and it will keep others away." She understood. He had sent a message, one that would echo through taverns and keeps, one that would reinforce the very legends that protected this place. He had turned the intrusion into a warning. It was strategic, brutal, and perfectly executed. "You're hurt," she said, seeing the tightness around his eyes. "I will heal," he said. "The sun is setting. The darkness will restore me. But I should go inside." He did not release her hand. Instead, he led her back toward the dark spire of his keep, their steps perfectly in sync. They walked not as protector and protected, but as two parts of a whole. She had made her choice, and in doing so had bound herself to his world, to his twilight existence. The thought held no terror for her. They entered the great hall of his home, the same room where she had first awoken. A fire was already burning in the massive hearth, as if it had anticipated their return. He led her to the two tall-backed chairs by the fire, and finally released her hand, sinking into one of them with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. He looked tired, drained, but the profound loneliness that had always clung to him was gone. Ella knelt on the hearthrug beside his chair, looking up at him. The firelight softened the sharp angles of his face, warming his pale skin. She reached out and placed her hand on his knee, a simple, grounding touch. "They won't send more," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "Valerius will not risk the story getting out, not the true story. That his best men were destroyed by the Blackwood, that one fled in terror. His pride will demand he declare you dead, a tragic victim of the forest. You are, for all intents and purposes, a ghost now. Free. Free." It was the word he had always offered her. She was free from her past, from her name, from the world that had tried to put her in a cage. But her freedom was no longer an empty, open road. It had a center, a home. "This is all I ever wanted," she said softly. "Not to be a ghost, just to be left in peace." He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was as cool as ever, but it no longer felt alien. It felt like coming home. "I have been at peace for centuries, Ella. A long, cold, empty peace. It was you who taught me the difference between peace and silence." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. The journey that had begun in a desperate, terrified flight had ended here, in the quiet heart of the monster's lair. She had run from a cage of gilded brocade and found freedom in the arms of eternal night. The seasons turned in the valley, though the change was subtle. A deepening of the twilight here, a shift in the scent of the air there. Ella's garden flourished under her care, a vibrant patch of life and color in the muted landscape. She filled the shelves of the cottage with more books from his library, her mind, so long starved, feasting on knowledge. He taught her the names of the stars, the language of the forest, the history of a world she had only ever known from a single, narrow window. And she, in turn, taught him what it was to live in the present. She brought laughter into the silent halls of his keep. She filled the quiet with her singing. She showed him the simple, profound joy of watching a seed sprout, of reading a book together by the fire, of sharing a silence that was not born of loneliness, but of perfect understanding. He never asked for anything from her, not even her love. He simply accepted what she chose to give, and he gave, in return, his whole world. Her sanctuary was no longer just the valley. It was him, and his was her. One evening, as autumn turned the world to gold and crimson for the third time since she'd arrived, Ella set down her book and looked at William across the fire. "I will grow old," she said quietly. It was not a question, but a statement of fact she'd been avoiding. He met her gaze, unflinching. "You will," he acknowledged, "and I will not." The words hung between them, heavy with implications. "I could offer you what I am," he said carefully. "Eternity, the same twilight existence I endure. But I will not make that choice for you, Ella. I will not take your mortality without your freely given consent, and I will not ask for it. If you wish to live your natural span here, in peace, I will be honored to witness every moment of it. And when your time comes, I will mourn you for the rest of mine." She was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the gift he was offering, the choice itself. "Ask me again," she said finally, "when I am old enough to truly understand what I would be giving up. For now, I want to live this life, fully, while it is mine." He nodded slowly, relief and sorrow mingling in his ancient eyes. "Then we will speak of it again, when you are ready, if you are ever ready." The conversation settled something between them, an acknowledgement of the future that made the present all the more precious. They continued their quiet life, each day a deliberate choice to be together, to build something in the space between mortality and eternity. Years passed, marked not by calendars, but by the deepening of their bond. Ella's face gained fine lines at the corners of her eyes from laughter. Her hands grew stronger from her work in the garden. William remained unchanged, eternal, but the loneliness that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a quiet contentment that transformed him in ways no physical change could match. One evening, years after the last of Valerius's men had vanished into the shadows, they sat on the stone bench, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance. Ella leaned her head against his shoulder, a comfortable, familiar gesture. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stumbled into his forest. She was a woman who had found her own strength, her own power, in a place the world had deemed terrifying. "Do you ever miss the sun?" he asked, his voice a low murmur against her hair. She thought for a moment, picturing the harsh, unforgiving light of her former world, the light that exposed and judged, the light that had illuminated the bars of her cage. "No," she said, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. "I have learned to prefer the stars." He turned his head, and in the soft, silver light, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or of desperation, but of a deep, abiding peace. It was a kiss that tasted of ancient stone and fresh earth, of silent centuries and new beginnings. It was the closing of a door on one life and the quiet, certain opening of another. In the heart of the forbidden forest, the runaway bride and the vampire lord had built a sanctuary not of stone and shadow, but of mutual respect, of genuine choice, and of a love that had grown, patient and strong, in the safety of the twilight.